appreciate everybody being here this morning. I'm hoping to pick up kind of where we left off last week as we tread behind Jesus as he goes through the land teaching and so forth. You'll notice in chapter 13, verse 1, it was on the same day that Jesus has this event occur in his teaching. The entirety of chapter 13, basically. And by the way, I did make a mistake in the bulletin. I was just checking to see if anybody knew, but instead of 43, it was supposed to be 53. Okay? But what we're going to do is go through 8 parables this morning. Now, that's basically what you would call hydroplaning. Which, by the way, if you look that up, that's when a car is driving on wet pavements and going too fast. But we got to hustle here, because if you go through 8 parables, all 8 parables basically are talking to us about the kingdom of heaven, what it's like. And it's interesting that it's on this same day that Jesus dives into this description of who we are, who we actually are supposed to be. And that's what this is talking about. As a matter of fact, I am really going to be pointed this morning about the idea of growth in the church, the kingdom of heaven, and how it produces and how it grows, what happens to cause it to do that. That's what Jesus begins talking about, which is interesting because just prior to this, he has had an event with some Pharisees and some Sadducees, and they have accused him of doing the miracles that he's doing in a combination with his teaching to Satan, and he corrects them for that. And then, of course, it goes on just a little bit further, and he tells them about the fact that if you deny or you will not accept the words that Christ speaks, which are derived from the Holy Spirit, from God himself, then you're not going to be able to be forgiven. And so they want another sign, which is a sign of rebellion. And so you get finally down to the end of it, and he tells people in the last verse of this chapter 12, he said, whoever does the will of my Father, that's family. Okay? Now, that's where we're picking up here. He is about to describe the spiritual family, who we are. And what makes it phenomenal when you begin in chapter 13 of Matthew in the first verse, it is on this same day. Well, evidently this stuff took place in this 12-hour day, as the Jews had it, in the morning time. And then it was sometime after that he went out from the house. Evidently he left the multitude, chapter 12, verse 46. He left that bunch of multitude, went to a house somewhere, and then at some point in time came out from that house and went and sat down by the sea. And you could tell that the press of the multitudes was always on Jesus, because he no sooner got out there sitting beside the sea in verse 1 that the multitudes just enthronged him. It just went all over him. He was everywhere. You couldn't get away from him. So he gets in a boat. And I love the brilliance of things as God explains things, because any fellow that knows about boats knows you don't stand up in a boat. Okay? So he gets in a boat, and it says he got in a boat and he sat. And so he's out there in a boat, getting a little bit away from the crowd so that he can teach the crowd. And he begins, and I love the way that Jesus teaches, because yes, there are so many things we can infer from what God implies. But 9 times out of 10, when Jesus wants to make a point, and it's a real simple point, he's going to tell us every detail we need to know. And so he goes at the very beginning and says, behold, a sower went out to sow. If you're in the family of God, here is who you are. You are a sower. And if you don't sow, you're not in the family. You know, we talk, and I've heard many comments, I've made many my own self. It's not the preacher's job to grow the church. No, quite the contrary. 1 Corinthians 3:6 tells us, no, it's planting and watering, which we're not having to water a whole lot because we've had a lot of rain here recently. Congrats to that. If you planted anything, it ought to be really well watered right now. But God gives the increase. But our job is to plant and water. And you know, that very first statement he makes here in this parable, a sower went out to sow. That's what a sower does. We are Christians, and that's what we do. It's an interesting phenomenon. We see it actively happening in Acts, the 2nd chapter. You know, Acts, the 2nd chapter, Peter and the rest of the apostles, what's the first thing they do when the Holy Spirit lights on them and they start preaching and teaching the gospel? That's what we do. And there were more there than just the 12, although those were the chief spokesmen. There was 120 there, because that was the original group from Acts 1, the last end of the chapter. But you know, this is the nature of who they are, because notice in chapter 4, and you can look there in chapter 4 of Acts, verses 19 and 20, they have been preaching so much that it's stirring up Jerusalem. And the leaders of the temple and stuff are coming and grabbing them up and saying, y'all quit talking like this. Y'all quit preaching and being so active. When's the last time in Hamilton people grabbed you up by the scruff of your neck and said, y'all quit being so active as the church here at Park Heights? It's just too much of y'all going around telling people about Christ. You know, that's what they did. And notice what he says in verse 19. But Peter and John answered and said to them, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you more than to God, you judge. And here's the point. For we cannot but speak the things which we have seen and heard. Folks, if we were to get two big buckets up here and we were to put one bucket on one side of all of those who can't help it, they have to talk to their neighbors and their friends. They can't help themselves. It's just so much a part of them. It's so exciting, the hope of going to heaven, and the fact that people who are in error can be taught and changed, and they can do what's right, and they can go to heaven with us. And there's the bucket. That's where one bunch is, and here's the other bucket who, well, they do show up to church, quote unquote. They do fill a pew or a chair in our instance. They do claim to be a member here. I'm amazed at when I first came here, and it still is the case, I think, in a lot of regards. I have met more members of the Park Heights Church of Christ in this community that aren't here this morning. And they haven't been here the 3 years I've been here. And come to find out with many of them, who some have showed up and have come back and visited, who claim to still be members in the Park Heights Church. I won't even hesitate to say that's the bucket over here. You know, if we're going to be in the family of God, it comes with a nature that we have, a response we have of gratitude to Christ for saving our soul and for being on board with what the Spirit teaches. And we can't help ourselves but at least try to develop relationships with people wherein we have opportunity to tell them there's a wonderful place called heaven. I want you to go with me. It's just what a sower naturally does. You don't need a class. You know, I love Fishers of Men. I love some of the product that Stuart puts out for helping us study with people. But folks, when you know somebody and you love their soul and you are a part of the family of God, it is just natural. And Jesus articulates that. He doesn't leave that for our inferring something from what he has implied. He just says a sower goes out and he sows. That's what he does. It ought to be so natural with us to tell people about Christ. And of course we use that phrase, and that is such an all-encompassing paradigm under which we will operate when you talk about telling somebody about Christ. What does that involve exactly? How does that work? Well, it comes with appreciation of our actual being, who we are. You go a little bit further, and it's interesting too that it comes with an urgency, but it also comes with a responsibility. Verse 12 is not stuck in there just as an afterthought. Verse 12 actually is the hinge upon all of this, how it works. And Jesus tells the parable that Pete read just a moment ago, and then he explains the parable later on in the chapter. But there's a hinge point in there in verse 12. And this is what I think ought to sober us up a bit about who we are as the family of God. What is required of us, but you know, really honestly, that's a wrong way to say it. It's what we should desire to do. It ought to be innate within our DNA, our Christian DNA, to do this because that's who we are. But notice what he says in verse 12. And by the way, he says this in the context of explaining to his apostles what he's saying. A little later on, he'll tell them, you know, there's a lot of people that are hearing this and they don't get it. Okay? Their mind is blinded. They got ears to hear and they don't hear. But he said, you're blessed because you hear. Then he lays it on them. He says, for whoever has, to him more will be given, and he will have abundance. But whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. You know what? If you don't exercise a muscle, I've begun to realize this as I get older. There are things that I do now, and they hurt. Maybe some of y'all relate to that. I used to do this, and it didn't hurt. Now I do it, and it hurts. I have begun to get older, and I don't do some of these things as much as I used to, and I have discovered if you don't use a muscle, after a while, it hurts to use that muscle in a way that maybe previously you had used that muscle and it wasn't a problem. And that's a natural course of things. As we get older, our muscles don't function as well as they did, and we've really got to work at it. I've always thought just walking is such a waste of time. But you know, you read the old poets, and they made quite the thing about walking through the woods and observing. But it was the walking part that they were really stressing. You look at health nuts these days, and they'll tell you, don't jog, that'll beat your knees to death. Of course, I'm now to an age I can't jog. People say, you need to run. I can't run. If I run, I pull more muscles than I have. But walking, walking anymore, as mundane as it may seem, is so incredibly healthy for the body because you're exercising muscles that you don't normally use. We're such a sedentary society. Our leisure is sedentary. Our work very often is sedentary. The fact is, these days, I got kids at work, and very often they don't even go to a location to work. They just plug into a computer, and there they go. And they're working right there on their couch in their pajamas. I always thought it was funny back in Buda a long time ago when I was living next to my son. I'd go over to his house, and he would be in a conference, a very important conference, and he would be Zooming, I think is what you call it. And he would be in a conference, and there he is in his nice tailored shirt, and he's right there on the screen, and down below he's in his pajamas. That's kind of the way we do it. It's so sedentary anymore. And you know what? I think that has kind of seeped over into our Christianity. I think as Christians very often we're sedentary. We have forgotten who we are and what our purpose is, and the muscles we used to use, or perhaps should have used to use. It's amazing to me how excited a new Christian can be. In fact, some older Christians, it's kind of annoying because, they're wanting to do something. They're all excited. They have just been converted. They know now that I'm not going to hell, I'm going to heaven. It's wonderful. And they're excited, and they want to tell somebody. What happens to that with us? Where does that excitement go? Have we all just become cynical when it comes to Christianity? And we show up and we punch our clock and we did our due for God today. And so we'll go on back to the work week and we'll do whatever it is that we're going to do. That's not who we are. Every opportunity when we see our neighbors, every opportunity. We go to Walmart. It's amazing the conversation. Of course, a lot of that has to do with personality. I understand not everybody's an extrovert like me. But you would be amazed at the conversations I have in Walmart with total strangers. Or maybe you wouldn't, you know me. But it's amazing how you can sit down, and it doesn't take me long, but that I've twisted or changed or veered off on a course in a conversation with a total stranger and talk about God. Now, mind you, I've been doing this a while. The muscles that create that are almost automatic anymore, okay? Which is the way we should be. And I would encourage you to start looking at life that way. We are Christians. That's what we do. That's who we are. To the point that when it begins to be a stir, our response is, how can we do anything but tell what we know, what we've seen in God's Word? How do I keep from it? You can't. Jeremiah talked about it when he decided those Israelites not going to listen to me. I'm just going to shut my mouth and let them all go on to damnation. That's their path. That's what they want. And then he said, the fire in me is so strong I can't help myself. I've got to preach. I've got to teach. I've got to warn those I love and care about. Couldn't help himself. I shocked the guys at the school when I was doing that little bit of teaching in rhetoric. The class was rhetoric that I was teaching at the Southwest School of Bible Studies. And one of the first things I did when I got in the class is I asked them all about their previous life before they came to the preaching school to learn how to be a preacher and learn Bible and stuff. And as we went through it, I finally told them all, I said, folks, all you guys, If you can make good money at something else, go do it. Now, you wouldn't believe the shocked expressions on their faces. They were there to get encouragement to be a preacher. I said, no. We don't need guys in here that can do a lot of other things and would rather do them and make good money at them. We need guys in here who just can't help it. They got to tell somebody about God. That's who we need for preachers. We need guys who can't function, can't breathe if they're not preaching. I've not preached during my preaching career on several occasions, taking secular jobs. I worked in the oil field a little while, building sewage plants. I've worked in the post office. I was a postmaster for a little while. I mean, I've done other things, and you know what? There's nothing like speaking and preaching and teaching God's Word. That's the kind of people we are as Christians. And by the way, you will notice in Acts 8:4, when the persecution came, the sowers went forth to sow. They didn't go to a class, they didn't have a seminar, they just went everywhere because of persecution, telling people about the Christ. That's who we are. The apostles told those guys that were telling, hey, if you do this again, we're going to beat you. We can't help ourselves. We've got to do this. That's who we are. Sometimes I believe our spiritual muscles have atrophied. They're not functioning like they should because too often and too regularly and too easily we are able not to say something to someone. Now granted, there's a lot of nuance that goes along with this, and we'll talk about that another time, but the fact is we have to have a mentality that understands what this existence in this family is about. Now the parables that follow are descriptions of the kingdom, and so how does that fit with this first parable, the parable of the sower? Well, if you're talking about the kingdom and you can't help yourself, there must be motivation, and I believe all of these parables have to do with a motivation that Jesus is trying to instill in people so that you go out and do what you need to do. Now the first one he tells us about are the parable of the tares. Well, isn't it interesting that wheat and tares, wheat and weeds, by the way, for those of you that are not old King James. But you know, you talk about you plant a crop and then you got weeds you grow up in the crop. Why would that come right after he talks already about planting and sowing the seed and how it falls on different grounds? Well, there's obviously a reason. The motivation is the idea of urgency and judgment. You see, there's going to be a judgment. And the consequence of that judgment is going to be equal in extent. Because you look at Matthew 25:46, I believe it is, where it talks about those who are God's are going to go to everlasting life, and those who are not going to eternal condemnation. And so you're looking at two separate places. That's not really a place. It's existential. It's an existence that we're going to have. But the existence is going to be permanent. It's like forever. I know that's a hard concept to quantify in our own minds, but it's not like right now where we have today, and then we'll be done with today, we have tomorrow, and we remember back at yesterday. Those kinds of things don't exist where this is. It's all one, existence, but it's forever. You know, I've heard a lot of people, you hear these, bless their hearts, as they stand together, man and woman facing one another in a wedding vow and say, I will love you forever. And it won't happen. Not because they're going to have troubles in their marriage. All marriages have troubles. But no, it's not going to happen in their marriage because the marriage isn't going to last forever. One of them, very likely, if they live all of their life together, one spouse may pass from this life to the next existence. And when the other spouse passes and joins them, they're not going to be married. But they are going to be together. And that's what I hope Kelly and I both on the same page on that one. We hope to be together, but we won't be married. You know, there's so many things we think are forever, and they're not forever, technically. It's hard to wrap our brains around the idea that there's going to be a judgment. And so he talks about the tares and the wheat. And I've heard this misused many times. In my younger days, I made the mistake of misusing it. But when we let the Bible describe things and define things, you'll notice in verse 24, the kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. Okay, we're going to be sowing good seed in his field. I've often heard people talk about that being the church, but that's not true. Over in verse 38, the field, Jesus says, as he explains this parable, is the world. So What is the nature of it? You don't even have to really articulate it so much as to understand this is what we do. We sow the seed. You see the theme that's coming in here? It is something we always do. That's who we are. In fact, this assumption is made all throughout every parable. Look in verse 31. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. A man took and sowed it in his field. There you go again. What do? We sow the seed. It's even used differently when it comes to a lady. This kingdom of heaven is like leaven in verse 33, which a woman took. You know, Jesus is an equal opportunity employer when it comes to Christianity. Woman took it like leaven, took it and hid it 3 measures till it leavened the whole lump. Okay? One of these is kind of looking at a mustard seed, you wouldn't think much, but grows huge. It's amazing what you're being the person you should be in this family will do. And the second one is something one does intentionally, understanding this is the consequence that's going to happen. Notice in the next one, then he explains a little bit about the judgment of the other parable of the tares. But then in verse 44, again, the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hid in the field. Well, that's where you just stumble on something, you find it, it's hid, you found it. That is amazing, because you know it's amazing when we speak and when we do the sowing we should be doing, it is amazing who will respond. I really do think that keeps us from being as effective as we should be when it comes to talking to those who we should be talking to, which is, by the way, everybody. We get kind of selective, don't we? We make prejudgments about people, and we decide, you know, they don't like us, or they're not really interested in spiritual things, or the list goes on forever of reasons, and let's be honest, they're not judgments made about somebody else based on good data. It's an excuse for us not to say anything. Let's be honest. That's what it is. We're just finding reasons, rationalities, so that we don't have to say something when in reality we ought to be saying something. And that's what this whole chapter is about. We need to be saying something. And so you look at a mustard seed, well, that's not much. You look at leaven, well, you know, put a little tiny bit of leaven, it does all kinds of things. But then again here, you go into a field and look at what you found, and you wasn't even expecting it. It's not quite the same as seeking pearls in the next parable in 45. We're seeking pearls actively, and then we come across one, and it's worth everything to us. Every one of these has to do with doing something about who we are. The kingdom of heaven in verse 47 is like a dragnet. A dragnet doesn't catch the fish, that big thing you throw out there with the weights on the end, and then you pull it in, and it just takes up all these fish. And you got some that's good and some that's not good. You get the good ones, throw out the bad ones, but nevertheless, you throw the net wide. That's who we are. We're not the fisherman that sits there and is terribly picky about each one that we, you know, and I don't understand this because I'm not a fisherman. I'm a hunter, but I'm not a fisherman. I've never had the patience to drown worms. And that's normally what I end up doing. But as I have discovered from experienced fishermen, you bait your hook for a different kind of fish. And so when you throw the hook out there, there's a particular kind of fish you're looking for. A dragnet is not that way. You throw it broad, kind of like the parable of the sower when you go out to sow the seed. They don't carefully go down and just touch it. Here's a good piece of ground. We're going to stick a seed in there. And I've seen people that plant in rows and they pile up the dirt and they plant a little seed in that dirt, and that's where it's expected to grow. That's not the way we do. We throw it out there for everybody. In fact, if you look at the analogy that he uses here, the illustration in the parable, you sowing a seed, the way they sowed it is broadcast, what you call it. You just throw it out there. I mean, we're all complicated these days with machines that go down a row and plant it right in a row. Not in the old days. In the old days, you just threw it out there and it went everywhere. And that's what you expected to grow. Dragnet, you throw it out there, you catch everything. You never know what you might catch. And finally, the last parable, he talks about the fact that we as scribes, now I don't know whether you've ever considered yourself somebody like a scribe. Very smart, very wise, very knowledgeable. But you know what? As Christians, as people who are of the family of God, we need to know our book so well that from our house we bring out treasure. All kinds of stuff that's good for people. Folks, when you look at this entire chapter, down to 53 anyway, 54 starts a bit of a different thought. But the entire thing is about what makes up the kingdom. And in this kingdom, as it began in chapter 13, verse 1, or I'm sorry, verse 2 or 3, A sower went out to sow. That's who we are. Now, those two buckets I mentioned earlier, those who just can't help themselves, they have to talk to somebody, that's where we need to be. We all need to be that way. In Acts 8:4, when the persecution arose, they went everywhere. It doesn't say the preachers went out and preached the word. It doesn't say the elders went out or the deacons. It says all those that are scattered, all Christians went out everywhere preaching the gospel. That being the case, you and I are responsible for, tasked with, if you want to go negatively, or positively, have the privilege and the benefit of knowing our future. We talked extensively this morning. I loved Boyce's class this morning about hope. Hope is so underrated, I'm afraid, in many Christian circles. I don't know why. But folks, we have hope. How does that not motivate you to want to take somebody with you? It's hard to party by yourself. You need company. It's more fun with more people. Why do we not have that mentality when it comes to Christianity? And why is it that we allow ourselves to be comfortable not being who we should be as part of the family? Folks, if you're not speaking to your friends and neighbors, if you're not talking to them, if you're not trying your dead level best to influence others and show them the way, rethink your Christianity. Because the family of which Jesus speaks of here says those who obey the Father, that's whose family. That's my brothers, my brother, my sister. That's whose family. We are family. But we are family based on a very specific DNA. Started there in Acts 2 when the apostles got up and when they were trying to be squelched. No, not going to happen. I cannot help it. I have to teach. I have to tell. I have to show somebody how wonderful heaven's going to be. Now, granted, you're not going to get everybody to drag down. There's some fish you throw out. Tares are in the wheat. I understand that. Nevertheless, the whole function of our DNA is such that we're going to tell somebody else about it. Somebody around us is going to know what's priority in our life. If you're not that kind of Christian, I invite you to rethink your Christianity, because that's what Christ intended. And that's what we see lived out in the New Testament. People going everywhere teaching others how to be saved. If you need to respond in any way to the invitation, we always offer one in song, and we invite you as we stand.